Hey, AP Lang teachers, Beth Hall here from Coach Hall Writes. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about how to teach our students to write more sophisticated essays. Before we begin, let's be sure to stay in touch. Please make sure that you are subscribed, hit that bell to turn the notifications on. And also, teachers, don't forget to check out the description box below. There you will find links to a variety of things, including my teacher email list, my TPT store, and more. When AP Lang teachers hear the phrase sophisticated writing, I think they tend to think about the sophistication point. So let's go ahead and talk about it in terms of the AP Lang exam. In past years, approximately 5 to 9% of students would earn the sophistication point. Now, this number does vary depending on which year we're talking about and also which FRQ. Over time, this point has become known as the unicorn point. And here's the thing, while the point is rare, it's not unattainable. To quote my friend Stephanie Kirk, who is a fantastic AP Lang consultant from Tennessee, she says, "I've never seen a unicorn, but I have seen lots of sophisticated essays." So let me tell you a little bit about my experience. Last year, I started focusing on consistently incorporating elements of sophisticated writing into my lessons and assignments. I believe this consistency was a contributing factor to an increased number of sophistication points. Now, as I told my students, my goal was not necessarily for them to earn the sophistication point on every essay. I think sometimes students put a tremendous amount of pressure on themselves to earn that point, but I did want them to become stronger writers. We were looking at it more objectively as this is a process, and we want to be thinking about how do we implement what we're talking about in class in our own writing. So here's the thing that I noticed. As my students were trying to incorporate more sophisticated writing, even if they didn't earn the sophistication point, their commentary was stronger. Also, I will say, for what it's worth, teachers, in my classroom during the school year, I tend to award a half point for sophistication. That's just my way of acknowledging that students are making progress, even if it wouldn't earn the point on the exam. My first tip is to know the bullet points. So if you're familiar with the AP Lang rubric, you would know that there are bullet points on row C where it talks about sophistication. And for each of the rubrics, it tells how students can earn the sophistication point. There are a couple things we want to recognize. One is that sophistication has to be consistent. We need to see it throughout the whole essay in different places, not just in one single line. Also, we want to recognize that because there are different ways that students can earn the point, they just have to do one of those bullet points. Now, truth be told, some of the best essays I've ever read have arguably earned the sophistication point for more than one bullet point, but we're just looking for one bullet point to start out with. As a teacher, I find it helps to know the bullet points because then I know what to start incorporating into my lessons when my students are ready. But also, my stronger writers who are ready for that sophistication point sooner tend to benefit from knowing the bullet points as well. Because then, as they're planning out their essay, they can say to themselves, okay, for this prompt, I think I want to go for vivid and descriptive style. Or maybe for this prompt, I think I could do broader context. I've also found that because I know the bullet points, I'm able to look for those bullet points, if you will, in the text that we read in class. So I'm able to point out sophisticated writing to my students based on what we're reading, and that way they could use that as a model or an exemplar. Tip number 2 is to work it into your lessons. Now, for me, this was the game changer last year. So let's start by talking about some things we could do for any of the FRQs. For each of the FRQs, students can earn the sophistication point by having a vivid and persuasive style. My students also take the ACT as juniors. And for the ACT, they need to know how to use advanced punctuation correctly. Now, granted, I'm talking about multiple choice questions here, but if they can understand it for that, then they should be able to hopefully apply it to their own writing. So typically, I start my school year with grammar bell work. Each week, I introduce a new grammar skill. And then usually by the end of the first marking period, we've covered enough that I can comfortably say to students, hey, in your paragraph that you're writing for class, please include a semicolon used correctly, or please include a colon or dashes. And so when I start to include grammar requirements in my assignment instructions, I notice that with practice, students start to use these techniques on their own. And trust me, that is a really cool teacher win to see students using punctuation like colons and dashes on their own without you telling them to. One of the things that I do when I'm working it into the assignment instructions is I tell my students to highlight it. And so I try to keep the colors really consistent. So for example, grammar might be highlighted in yellow and vocab might be highlighted in green. Pick whatever color scheme works for you, but stick with it for each assignment because it will help you and your students. I like it when students highlight it because number one, it reminds them to include that punctuation, and also it draws my attention to it as I'm scoring. Another way to help students' writing style is to add in adjectives and adverbs to make the writing more precise. I like to do this as a revision exercise because that way students have the time to go back and give their words an upgrade. Something else that I'll do to help with word choice is depending on the assignment, I might pick anywhere from 1 to 3 vocab words that are somehow related to the passage. And if my students are doing a quick writing assignment, I might have them include those words in their paragraph. This has been a great way to increase my students' vocabulary with phrases like garner support for or to mitigate. So basically, what I try to do is I try to think of words that I would want them to eventually be comfortable using. And we talk about what the word means and how to use it, and they practice putting it in their paragraph. Now, I don't do this for every assignment, but when I do, like I said before, I have them highlight those words. That way, it draws my attention to it. Also, sometimes I will let them pick the vocab words. So I will have them pick words that they think are more sophisticated, and I'll have them highlight those. Later on in the year, I have a conversation with my students about how when we study writers for rhetorical analysis, we study the rhetorical choices that they're making. When they are writing an essay, they are a writer. So therefore, they get to make rhetorical choices. And usually when we have this conversation, you can see the light bulbs turning on sometimes. And so one of the things that I have my students do is practice making effective rhetorical choices. Again, a lot of times I will put this in the assignment instructions. And when I do, I try to offer some sort of example or model. I also like to give choice for this. So for instance, I might tell students if we're doing a Q3 body paragraph, hey, I want you to make a rhetorical choice. You can either do an anecdote or detail. And I tell them that when I read their body paragraph, I should know exactly which choice they're making. I want it to be super clear. Now let's talk about the essays individually, starting with rhetorical analysis. One of the ways that students can earn the sophistication point is by examining the broader context and really thoroughly connecting the rhetorical choices to the rhetorical situation. So when I'm planning my lessons, I ask myself about my students' background knowledge. What do they already know about the rhetorical situation? So for instance, if I'm teaching a historical speech, I might go talk to my coworker who does APUSH and ask her if she's already covered this time period. In the past, there have been a few times where we have worked very closely together. I've been able to kind of move some of my passages around to where she teaches that time period first, and then a week later, my students write a rhetorical analysis essay. I know not everybody has the ability to do that, and it certainly doesn't work for every text that I do. But it has been nice when we've kind of had these interdisciplinary connections, especially because she and I share multiple students. Now, in the instances where my students might not know a whole lot about the rhetorical situation, I might create an assignment where they have to do a web quest or they might listen to a podcast. So for the web quest, it can be super simple. For instance, last year, my students were looking at a speech from a DNC and a speech from an RNC. I chose these passages from AP Classroom. And so what I had my students do is I had them look up specific info about the speaker, what was going on in that political party at the time, things like that. So basically I gave them guided questions, just a few, in order to help them get that background knowledge, but they had to go search for the information. I also really love podcasts because there are some great history podcasts out there where students are getting to hear history experts talk about famous people or famous events. Now, as far as how I implement this in my classroom, that's where it gets a little bit tricky because schools are starting to get more strict with cell phone policies, and also some podcasts are available online, but then some sites are blocked and things like that. So if you're going to incorporate podcasts, please make sure you just double check that your students are able to access that podcast. Also, TED Talks or YouTube videos, depending on what the topic is, could be helpful in this regard as well. One of the ways that I've helped my students become more confident writers over the years is by giving them sentence frames. Now, I have a separate video all about my favorite rhetorical analysis sentence frames, so I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I did give you a couple examples of how you might give students a sentence frame that helps them connect the choice and the rhetorical situation. I'll be sure to link that video that I mentioned in the description box below. I'll also link my sentence frames down there as well in case you don't want to reinvent the wheel. Another way that students can earn the sophistication point is by examining tensions and complexities. This is definitely something that I'm going to emphasize more throughout my rhetorical analysis units in the coming year. And as I was planning for my upcoming school year, I really started to think about what tensions or complexities do I want my students to pick up on? So the first one I thought of was speaker and audience tension. And there are two prompts that came to mind. One is the Gandhi prompt where he's writing the letter to Lord Irwin. The other is Abigail Adams' letter to her son, John Quincy. Personally, I consider both of these prompts a bit more challenging, and so I saved them for the second semester, really close to the exam. But what I like about these prompts is students can examine the tension present between the speaker and audience, and that can really stand out in their commentary. In terms of other types of tension or complexities, I was thinking about maybe social or historical tension. This could also help with context as well. So two prompts that came to mind for me that I already teach are the Florence Kelly prompt and also the Madeleine Albright prompt. But I also listed some other options here because my students have really enjoyed Kennedy's We Choose the Moon speech, the Bush 9/11 speech, and FDR's Pearl Harbor speech. But basically, my goal for next year is going to be to more intentionally ask my students to think about these complexities or tensions in hopes that eventually they will do it on their own when they're given a prompt. Now let's talk about synthesis and argument. So for these essays, broader context, in my opinion, looks a little bit different, or at least the way I present it to my students looks a little different. So here are some questions that I want my students to think about as they examine a prompt. First of all, do I have any relevant or meaningful experience with this topic? One of my students' biggest fears with synthesis is that they will be given a topic that they've never heard of. So one of the things that I try to tell them to do is to just kind of pause, because chances are you might know more about the topic than you realize. And if so, I want them to ask themselves, do I know any relevant or meaningful outside information about this topic? So for example, with the cursive writing prompt, I would want my students to say, what experience do I have with cursive writing? Or why is cursive writing being talked about today? What have I heard people say about cursive writing? I also want my students to think about why the topic is relevant in the short term and the long term. Basically, I tell them, even if you do not care about the topic or know anything about the topic, pretend for a second, especially as you're reading the sources, that you're passionate about the issue. What would you argue? I also tell my students to remember that there's a reason why somebody made a prompt about this topic. So really think about those deeper implications. Next up is nuanced arguments. So I try to address this in different ways throughout the school year. One way is something called the continuum activity, or at least that's what I call it in my lesson plans. Basically, what I do is I write the prompt or question on the board and I draw a continuum, so basically a double-ended arrow. And I have my students write a claim or a thesis in response to that question. Usually, I think it helps to let them have the option to work with a partner for this, especially if they're kind of new at it. I give them a lined Post-it note to write their claim on, and then when they're ready, they go stick it on the board. So basically the idea is that students will take their sticky note and put it on the continuum where it belongs. Many times students are going to have very similar claims, so they kind of stack them vertically. One of the reasons why I like this activity is because it shows students that there's multiple ways to argue a prompt and still write a good argument. Also, it's a way for me to teach students to avoid absolutes. Something else that I'll sometimes do is have students respond to a question with phrases like yes, but, or yes, except, no, but, or no, except. And you can even introduce this with like really like sort of fun or cheesy topics like, is a hot dog a sandwich? And then you can have your students pick yes or no, but they have to address the but or the except. Basically, it's helping them realize the parameters of that argument. So you can do this as a quick write if you wanted to. Now, like many of you, I also talk about counter arguments in my class. Addressing the counter argument is not a mandatory component of the AP Lang synthesis essay or argument essay. However, if executed well, it can lead to more sophisticated writing. As my students are reading text in class, if I see the writer addressing the counter argument, I try to call their attention to that. I also talk to my students about the difference between conceding versus offering a counterclaim. And we talk about, if you're going to address the counter argument in your essay, where does it belong? Now, keep in mind that with timed essays, the answer to this might be a little bit different. But in general, I tell my students that if you think your audience is pretty hostile and not going to want to agree with you or listen to you, you might want to address that counter argument sooner. However, if it's a pretty friendly audience, maybe you save it for the end. Many of my students like to kind of weave a counter argument into their existing body paragraphs, especially as they're getting comfortable using those sentence frames that I give them. Now, for exam purposes, I've noticed that a lot of students write a counter argument paragraph as their third body paragraph. Students do not need 3 body paragraphs. 2 is fine. However, one of the benefits of the counter argument being in the third body paragraph is that if students run out of time, they can cut that paragraph and their argument is still intact. So just some things to think about, because sometimes teaching for the exam versus teaching the skills are a little bit different. So just some things to think about, because sometimes what we encourage students to do for the exam might be different than what they would do if they had a longer period of time to write an essay. Tip number 3 is to use exemplars. So I like to show my students an essay that earned the sophistication point. And yes, I tell them that it did. What I have them do is, knowing that it earned the point, I want them to go through and identify or highlight the instances of sophistication. I usually let them work in partners for this, and then depending on how I want the lesson to go, we will either discuss what they highlighted or identified as a class, or I will have them write a scoring rationale. After they have discussed it or written their scoring rationale, then I have them look at the College Board's scoring commentary so they can see if their perception aligned with what the College Board said. Now, 2 of my favorite exemplars to use are the first 2 essays in the set of the 2018 essays for the Exploring the Unknown prompt. These essays are the ones that were rescored with the 6-point rubric. I'll link the document below if I can. One of these essays is fantastic if you're trying to show students how to transition and to connect back to their thesis and to link their ideas. In fact, sometimes when I've shown it to students, I've literally had them go through and highlight those connections or transitions, because it's just so well done and they can use this as a model. It's very approachable writing. I think a lot of times students hear sophistication point and they think, oh, I'll never get that. This one makes it more tangible for them, or at least that's what my students have experienced. The other essay is a 3-paragraph essay that starts out with a personal anecdote, and I feel it demonstrates vivid and descriptive style. In the past, I've actually shown my students both exemplars before they wrote their essay, and I told them, pick one of these techniques that you like. Many of my students like the anecdote as the intro paragraph, and they want to try to model that. So we talk about, making sure that they're choosing an important experience that shows personal growth and that they're providing the right details. But many of my students actually then apply this technique to future writing prompts, which I think is really great. That's what I love about it as an exemplar, is it's not only a great exemplar for the prompt itself, it's very student friendly, but it shows a technique that they could apply to other essays as well. And yes, students can write about themselves in a Q3 essay, and that actually is a choice that they can make. They could tell a detailed anecdote. Technically, they could do this in synthesis as well, but they just got to keep in mind that for synthesis, they also need to be referencing those sources, so we don't want to bite off more than we could chew, so to speak. My last tip is quick writes. So I like to have students do shorter writing assignments throughout the year, usually just like a quick body paragraph. Sometimes I will even time my students to get them used to a little bit of light pressure before the exam. The idea is to practice writing in a sophisticated way in micro, to have them focus on a specific skill, like maybe it's the vivid and descriptive style, or maybe it's writing an anecdote. I'll give you some examples in a second. But these quick writes are also a game changer for me because they're shorter assignments. So my students get the practice writing, but I don't have a ton of essays to grade. So here's one example. There's a prompt in AP Classroom about Meatless Monday. And so when we were talking about broader context for this one, students started talking about their own experiences with cafeteria food because it was relevant to some of the sources. I also had some students who were in like ag classes and FFA talk about how some of the stuff that they talked about in those classes or at FFA meetings aligned with one of the sources. And so what I had my students do is I had them choose to either write a creative intro in which they used a vivid and descriptive style, or they could write a body paragraph where they took their outside knowledge and used it as part of their commentary after they were citing that source. So they had the choice of one or the other. And so in one, they had the choice to demonstrate a vivid and descriptive style. And then the other, they had the choice of trying to go for that broader context. And I'll be honest, as far as grading, because you might be curious, I tend to look at these as, did they try? I don't look at it as, would this earn the sophistication point on the exam? I'm looking for growth. And so a lot of times, this is just writing practice for them. So I'm more looking for, did you meet the criteria of the assignment? Did you try it? Did you step outside of your comfort zone? I'm not looking for perfect writing, because I really want my students to realize that these assignments are where they can experiment, and these assignments are where they learn. I don't want them thinking that they're going to fail and it's going to be a bad grade. I want them to feel empowered to try something new, to try something a little different. Here's another example. Now, this one wasn't necessarily a quick write the last time I did it, but I think you'll get the idea here. So there's a prompt that I really like in AP Classroom, and it's about transforming kindergarten. However, when I teach this one, I sort of front load it with an article. I believe it's called The Joyful Illiterate Kindergartners of Finland. So my students read that, we do a rhetorical analysis, we have some very interesting discussions about how American kindergarten and kindergarten in Finland are different. I also show them part of a documentary. I believe it's a Michael Moore documentary, but in this documentary, they're interviewing teachers in Finland, and they're talking about what they do for their schooling. And so in class, we will spend a couple days talking about the article, the documentary, and then I give my students the prompt from AP Classroom. And we go through all those sources together. This is usually one of the first synthesis essays they write for me. However, as they prepare to either do their quick write, or if it's a full essay, that's fine too, I remind them that they have outside knowledge about kindergarten because they know about kindergarten in Finland. And I tell them that I want them to try, if appropriate, to incorporate that knowledge into their commentary. And we talk about how those other outside sources and that are now our outside knowledge connect to the sources we're given. So I try to use this as a way to model for my students how they can take what they know from class or just life in general and apply it to synthesis essay commentary. Now, I've also done some other quick writes for this prompt in the past where I've had students write me a body paragraph about something they remember from kindergarten, or they try to make it really vivid and descriptive. I've also had students go for a more broader context route where maybe they had a sibling or a cousin or somebody in kindergarten recently, and they compare and contrast their experience with their younger siblings or younger cousins. So there's different ways you could have students do a quick write about the topic of education as well. All right, AP Lang teachers, my goal for this video was to try to demystify the sophistication point a little bit and to offer tips to help us as teachers help our students to develop a more sophisticated writing style. So if you found this video helpful, please do me a huge favor and give the video a thumbs up. Also, if you have any suggestions for different things that have worked in your classroom, feel free to leave a comment. That way we can all learn from each other. And until next time, happy teaching!